God of War's been out for a while now, and everyone's still talking about it. I myself have completed it, gained the Platinum Trophy, and I'm in the middle of my Spank Me Till I Cry playthrough, and I've gotta be honest, it's making me feel like a bitch.
Loser, 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 you're a loser.
I feel myself playing this game for a long time though, because it's a good game, it's really fun to play, but despite my ever-growing, maybe you should put the controller down and finally take that addiction for Dad of Boy, I can't help but wonder what comes next for the franchise. One thing that everyone's talking about is Ragnarok, but as if it's some kind of big original thought that we should all gasp at. God of War is now rooted in Norse mythology. Why would it not use Ragnarok? Plus they even mention it multiple times at the end of the game. Look, it's all well and good talking about Ragnarok, just saying Ragnarok. It's a very exciting thought. But how about someone actually takes a guess as to how we get there? This is the fun part, guys, the part where we get to talk about the craziest theories possible. It's fun to just fling shit at the wall and see what sticks. So pop a squat and start straining, because it's going to get really awkward in a minute if I'm the only one with his hands covered in shit. Let's jump in. So, like I said, Ragnarok is clearly the path that we're on, but it seems that the traditional story of Ragnarok can only be applied in certain areas of the current story of Papa and Junior. To better understand, let's review the characters that are in play and are not in play by the end of the game. Let's start with the obvious, the Aesir gods. First up is Odin. In Papa and Hiho, Odin is seen as a ruthless god that doesn't really care about the common folk, or any other folk for that matter. If they're not the Aesir, he couldn't care less. This is pretty much the same as the old tales, but in El Grande y El Pequeño he seems incredibly paranoid. He keeps any hint of the Ragnarok prophecy for himself. He believes that the more knowledge of Ragnarok he has, the more likely he'll be to prevent it, just like Smegma. He even goes as far as sending Thor to wipe out the Jotnar, so that they can't fight him come Ragnarok, leaving only one giant left, Atreus, or as the end of the game revealed, Loki. We don't get to see Odin in the game, but I'll bet money he'll be teased in the next game, and that we'll fight him come Ragnarok. Next, we have Thor. In mythology, he's portrayed as somewhat of a hard-headed Neanderthalic douche who thinks he can do as he pleases, but with a hammer like Mjolnir, who could stop him? The game seems to carry that sentiment forward in the stories that are told about how ruthless he was towards the Jotnar. We also get to see him in a dream of Atreus's, when we return home after spreading Faye's ashes. In the tale of Ragnarok, Thor kills the world serpent Jormungandr, and then he himself dies by the venom that is released upon the serpent's death. However, it seems the two have already fought during Ragnarok, and that Thor hit Jormungandr so hard into Yggdrasil, more commonly known as the World Tree that we use to travel across the 9 realms, that he was actually sent back in time. Which explains why we see him in the game at all, since he's a child of Loki. But for the time being, Loki is just a boy. I know if you're not familiar with Norse mythology, this all seems insane at the moment, but hang in there. All will be revealed in due time. Now, onto Baldur. He's dead, just as he is in mythology, albeit in a very different manner. Traditionally, Baldur is killed by his own brother Hod, who was blind and tricked by Loki into throwing a mistletoe spear at his brother, whilst everyone else in Asgard was having fun with Baldur's newfound invincibility. But when Hod threw the spear, cheering stopped and crying began. Although, to be fair, if Loki, the god of mischief, puts a spear in your hand and tells you to throw it at your brother, you really should have seen it come. He's blind, he can't see anything coming. Oh well, moving on. In the game, Baldur is still killed in part by Loki when he punches the fragment of mistletoe arrow used to affix Atreus' quiver string. Baldur's death acts as a catalyst for Ragnarok in the traditional tales, as all things loved Baldur. Not just gods and mortals, but also the trees, the earth, stones, and even metal cried for him when he died. Loki is rightly seen as the reason for his death and is so punished in a most horrific way. Restrained by the innards of his dead son, with a snake's venom forever dripping in his eyes, prevented only by the small bowl his wife Sigyn holds over his face. It's easy to see why Loki would want to bring an end to the Aesir after that. The last of the Aesir to consider is Tyr, the god of war. Traditionally, he's there for Ragnarok to fight Garm, a monstrous hellhound, with only one hand at that, but both Tyr and the hellhound die in battle. If at this point you're wondering what happened to Tyr's hand, because throughout the game, in all depictions, he's always seen with both hands. Tyr lost his hand when a giant wolf named Fenrir chomped it off after the other Aesir tricked Fenrir and bound him to a mountain with a ribbon, the strongest bind to ever exist. Oh, and Fenrir, the giant mountain-sized wolf, he's another one of Loki's children. In the game, Tyr is said to already be dead after Odin smites him for conspiring with the giants, but nobody knows the details, which makes me think that he may still be alive, but I'll do you one better. I think that Tyr is Atreus. but again, I'll explain later. Next, we'll talk about the Vanir gods. Most obviously, we have Freya, Morning Mother and Queen of the Valkyries, who has sworn to bring down the most horrible atrocities upon Craig and Andy. Mimir informs us that whilst we were in Jotunheim spreading our mother's ashes, she asked him where she might find her warrior spirit that Odin had ripped from her. It's suspected that she may be returning to Vanaheim, her home, to find it. Although, Odin used Sidra magic to prevent her from ever leaving Midgard. Next of the Vanir is Freyr. That's with an R, not an A. Freyr is Freya's brother. He's briefly mentioned in the game as the master of the Light Elves, and a piece of scripture alludes to his powerful sword. What powerful sword is that, you may ask? Well, it's said that Freyr has the only weapon that may be able to stop the flaming sword of Surtur. I know, who the heck is Surtur now? Well, he's an ancient being who existed in a time long before the gods, in a time when it was only the cold mist of Niflheim and the blazing heat of Muspelheim. Surtur sits at the very edge of Muspelheim, awaiting the day of Ragnarok. It's said that his great flaming sword will burn the world and bring an end to the Aesir. If this sword sounds familiar, it's probably because it bears some resemblance to the sword stuck in the ground that we used to activate the Muspelheim trials. How awesome is that? However, depending on the events of Freyr's life that have already come to fruition, he may or may not have his fabled sword, as he may have already bargained it for his banging hot wife, Gerda. And it may be in the possession of a light elf instead. By this point, I bet you're thinking, but what about Mimir, the smartest man alive? Mimir is by far my favourite character in the game, I love him. But traditionally, he doesn't have a great part to play in Ragnarok. He's just a disembodied head floating in the bottom of his own well of knowledge. However, in this story, he will clearly stand front and centre with Kratos and Atreus. I doubt he'll have a huge part to play in all of it, but he'll be there on Kratos' belt to witness it all anyway. That's pretty much it for the people in play at the time of Ragnarok. There is Heimdall, the Watcher God, who is ultimately the one that kills Loki, but given that Atreus has never set foot in Asgard and Fimbulwinter has already begun, I doubt he'll be the one to end Atreus. It wouldn't feel very personal, would it? Oh my god, I almost forgot, Loki's children. Easily the most awesome and interesting part of Ragnarok. Loki does have some normal children with his normal wife Sigyn, namely 2 sons, Nafi and Vali. Nafi is whose guts Loki was bound in whilst he was tortured by the snake venom, and Vali was the one that ripped Nafi to shreds in the first place after the gods turned him into a wolf. I know, rough break. But he also has a set of more extraordinary children that were birthed by the giantess Angrboda. Don't ask me how this works because I have no idea. We'll start with the one that everybody knows about, Jormungandr, the World Serpent. We know that he's already fought with Thor and that he's been thrust back in time from Ragnarok. I think that Jormungandr is Kratos, but you guessed it, more on that later. The next is a child that must exist simply due to the name of one location in the game, and that is Loki's daughter, Hel, or Hela depending on your interpretation. A woman that on one half is fair and beautiful, but on the other is dead and rotten. With a particular affinity for the dead, Hel was placed in the land of the dead by Odin, so that she may watch over them, thus naming this land Helheim after its ruler. We never see her in the game or even hear of her, but simple logic would dictate that because Helheim is, well, called Helheim, she must exist. However, Dio della Guerra isn't traditional Norse mythology, so it's possible that she doesn't yet exist and Santa Monica Studio named it Helheim for the sake of notoriety. But here's hoping anyway. The last and arguably most powerful child is Fenrir, a giant wolf that once fully grown is larger than the mountains. That's no joke, he's a big boy. As mentioned earlier, in traditional mythology he bites off the hand of Tyr, since the Aesir gods trick Fenrir into being bound by an incredibly strong ribbon after he broke free from the strongest chains that ever existed. He doesn't bite the hand off because Tyr betrayed him though, it's more to do with a wager. Fenrir says that he will not accept being bound by the ribbon unless one of the gods places their hand in his mouth, as insurance that no trickery is afoot. Tyr, the only one that would feed and play with Fenrir as a pup, sacrifices his own hand, and so it was bitten off to fulfill the wager. Although in the game, not only is Tyr depicted with both hands, but Fenrir is never even mentioned. I believe that that's because they may be the same person. And I understand, I can hear you now, that's completely bonkers, you flush your bloody marbles mate, but we're so close now. Hold on just a little while longer and I'll explain everything. Oh, there is one other child named Sleipnir, an 8-legged horse that Odin rides into battle. Sleipnir may very well be in the following games in some capacity, but I very much doubt that it will be acknowledged as the child of Loki. This is because Sleipnir is not born of the mating of Loki and the giantess Angrboda, but instead from the mating of Loki and Svadilfari, a horse, and Svadilfari is not the one that births it. I very much doubt that Cory Barlog ever wants to put the imagery of Atreus being, shall we say, swooned by a horse into our minds. Okay, so that's it. All of the players have been established, so now let's finally talk about what might be next for the series, and how I believe that the events of Ragnarok will play out. So hold on to your nutsack, because this theory is pretty balls to the wall. I think the next chapter of the story will be all about the revenge of Freya and Thor. Freya for the death of Balder, and Thor for the death of his sons, Magni and Modi. I think that Freya will die, and Thor will be fought, but ultimately left until Ragnarok. Let's start off with Freya. I believe that she will somehow break the enchantment that binds her to Midgard. After all, she is a very powerful witch motivated by the grief of her dead child. She will also regain her warrior spirit. Once she gains this spirit, she will come back to attack Karl and Amadeus. After some back and forth between them, Freya will win one of the battles and capture Alan. She will torture him to inflict an even greater grief upon Carlos than that of the grief that he has inflicted upon her. I think that Freya will do damage to Arthur's eyes, whether it be by the snake venom, like the traditional tale, or with something else entirely. I think that Freya may look to take the gift of language away from him, something that he very clearly excels at. She starts with his eyes so that he may not read, and may eventually turn to his tongue, so that he may not speak. But before she can take his speech, Papa will save him. He will most likely unleash a rage upon Freya, the likes of which we have never seen. Atreus is all he has left of his wife Faye, and on top of that, Atreus is slowly becoming more than just his son. He's becoming his friend. I expect that whatever Kratos does to Freya may be a dark spectacle all of its own kind. These events will be what turn Atreus from the sweet boy that we have grown to love into the Loki that we expect come Ragnarok. This is not a Loki that is keen for mischief and dark humour, but one that is damaged and hellbent on the destruction of the gods. If you're wondering how Atreus' rage would extend from Freya to all of the gods, I expect that Freya would now be united in the original goal of the Aesir, to destroy the last of the giants, and also to rid them of the new threat that is Kratos, thus bringing them all together to destroy a common enemy, meaning that other gods may have had a hand in his capture and perhaps even his torture. So how does Thor fit into this? Not only has Thor lost his two sons, he also has lost his brother, Balder. I expect he will be filled with just as much rage as Freya. At the end of the game, we do get a glimpse of Thor in a dream, although this is said to be years later, yet Kratos and Atreus look as if they haven't aged a day. They're even wearing the same clothes, the dirty bastards. But this is more likely because it's a dream. Although it does make me wonder about how far in the future the next game will jump. Fimbulwinter may have already begun, but Ragnarok may still be some years away. I would like to see an Atreus in his late teens when he is at his most impressionable, so that Freya's torture has the biggest impact. Back to Thor though. I believe that Thor will work beside Freya in trying to kill Kratos and Atreus, and we may even see Freyr, and perhaps we'll get access to his sword. It would be a valuable weapon in case Surtur doesn't exactly pick a side come time for Ragnarok. After Kratos has saved Atreus and savagely killed Freya at the end of this chapter, or perhaps the game, I expect that Thor will try to fight, but Kratos' rage will be too great, and so he has to retreat and will fight him again come Ragnarok. Then there's the issue of Atreus' eyes. If I believe Atreus to be Tyr, then how is it that Tyr ends up with all-seeing eyes and Atreus at the moment has no eyes? I believe that Mimir will sacrifice his own eyes and give them to Atreus, as he believes that they will be of better use to him, that Mimir's time of great knowledge has been and gone, and that it's time to pass the torch. So then what happens after this? After being saved and shown extreme kindness by Mimir, why would Atreus walk the path of destruction? The path to Ragnarok? Simply put, I think that the torture he endures causes him to snap, making him reach a point of no return. So Atreus will abandon his father and his friends, and he will build an army. While he may not have the giants as he usually would in the story, there is always the army of the dead. But how would he enlist the help of this great army? Traditionally, he only has Ask, as Hel is his daughter, but while I think Hel will be in the game, I doubt she will be his daughter. Here's why. For Hel to become Queen of the Dead, someone has to place her in that position, someone with the power to do so. In Norse mythology, this honour falls to Odin, but this wouldn't make sense for the games as Loki doesn't live with the Aesir gods as he does in the mythos. So why would Odin spare the child of the last remaining giant, a race he has vowed to destroy, and then put her in charge of the dead? He wouldn't. That's why I believe that Hel already exists as the child of someone else, perhaps the failed child of Odin or Thor, who has been put in charge of the underworld against her will for her more hideous and shameful features, thus harbouring hatred for the Aesir. This would leave an opening for a now slightly older Atreus, perhaps in his early to mid-20s, to swoop in and marry her. I know that this sounds weird since she's usually his child, but in this story she wouldn't be. There's also the issue of her half-rotten face and body, but who knows, maybe it's rotten in a sexy kind of way. or not. Either way, marrying Hel would give Atreus access to the immense army of the dead. If by this point you're wondering how all of these time jumps would work, I expect it will probably have something to do with travelling between different realms, as we know that time works differently in each of them. Now that the army that Atreus will use in Ragnarok has been established, the only thing left before Ragnarok are his other two children, Fenrir and Jormungandr. I believe the former will be Atreus himself, and that Jormungandr will be created come the time of Ragnarok. Let's start with Fenrir. When Atreus is told by Kratos that he is a god, one of the things that he first asks is if he can turn into an animal. And yes, Loki is often said to have turned into many different kinds of animals, so why would he turn into the giant wolf Fenrir? I believe that the tunic that Atreus wears is some kind of foreshadowing. I think it's made from a wolf, and that Atreus and the wolf form are linked in some way. And I think he may become Fenrir on the day of Ragnarok to fight the Aesir. Lastly is Jormungandr, the World Serpent, who is said to have fought Thor on the day of Ragnarok and have been sent back in time after being knocked into the Yggdrasil with great force. I believe that Jormungandr only exists mere moments before he's sent back in time. I think that in the midst of the Battle of Ragnarok that Kratos will reach out to Atreus, asking him to stop the madness, pleading that they can be more than the gods, that they can be better and that there is still time to stop this. Atreus will hear to reason, but it will be too late. Not only are the Aesir, Vanir and the dead already in one ginormous battle that could never be stopped, but by this point, Surtur would have arrived with his ruddy massive flaming sword, setting everything on fire. Too many characters have been set in motion for them to be stopped. The only thing that Atreus can do now is change the reason that he fights. Instead of fighting to bring the destruction of the Aesir and take the 9 realms with them, he will fight for the future, for a brighter and more balanced world. Whilst fighting side by side for one last time, I think that Kratos will have to battle Thor. But I think that even Kratos isn't strong enough to withstand a mighty hit from Mjolnir, and so he'll be on death's door. This is where the prophecy that we see on the wall at the end of the game comes in. I've seen many say that Atreus will kill Kratos, but on the wall it seems as though Atreus is cradling his father's head, which would be a rather strange thing for a son filled with anger for his father to do. Instead, I think that he is dying and Atreus is holding his father in his final moments. But while struck with such great rage and grief, Atreus births the World Serpent from his throat, and it looks as though it's passed into Kratos. I don't know how this is possible, it seems completely wacky, but that's just what it seems like from the image. At this point, Kratos is reborn as the World Serpent Jormungandr and does battle with Thor. Thor will ultimately knock him back through time, but I think that in doing so he will cause a great explosion and may even kill himself, or at least leave himself open for Atreus to finish the job, but leaving Kratos trapped forever in the past. If Kratos is in fact Jormungandr, it does raise the question of how he can speak this forgotten language. There could be a number of explanations for this. One is that Kratos at some point learns it, as he does at least in part by the end of the game, and teaches him how to speak it. Another is that Jormungandr is actually part Atreus and part Kratos, thus gaining the knowledge of both of them. But if it is Kratos, why doesn't it just speak English? Perhaps its anatomy doesn't allow it to, or perhaps he can't remember it. It's said that one day Jormungandr just appeared in the Lake of Nine, but it doesn't say how long he's been there for. Perhaps many of his interactions were with the Jotnar, thus losing the ability to speak English. It happens to people in prisons of other countries that don't speak their native language, so why would it be so outlandish here when there's a giant, great big snake that can wrap itself around the world? Back to Ragnarok though. After killing Thor, the rest of the Aesir should be relatively easy for Atreus in Fenrir form to deal with, and perhaps Atreus somehow gets a hold of Freyr's sword, and is able to stop whatever rampage Surtur is on. Then once the violence stops, he will start to rebuild the world. He will travel across many different lands and times, as we now know that he knows it's possible, to gather knowledge that may help the new world he is trying to build, thus becoming Tyr. And maybe Tyr never actually dies by Odin's hand, since the details of his death are unclear. Maybe he escapes back to his own timeline to continue to rebuild after gaining so much knowledge. There is another alternative outcome that I thought of for this theory that's very similar to this one I just told, but also quite different. Atreus still becomes Tyr, travelling all worlds and realms to gather knowledge for the new world, except instead of being triumphant at Ragnarok, perhaps the fight ends when Jormungandr hits Yggdrasil. Maybe everyone gets lost in time at that point, and Atreus is thrown back to a time many years before Ragnarok, and must rebuild from there, to prepare himself for Ragnarok when he next faces it. Maybe the stories that we hear of Tyr are true, and that Atreus just failed his mission once he was killed by Odin, so he will be sent back at Ragnarok to try again. But of course, all of this is completely mad speculation. Odds are that none of this will happen and I'll be completely surprised. Probably by visiting other mythologies. I didn't include them in any major way in this theory because I thought that, if anything, they would be saved for their own game, rather than jumping between multiple of them in one game, and that maybe Atreus would be the one that we take control of. It would definitely help keep the franchise feeling fresh. Despite the fact that this theory is completely bananas, I kinda like it. It seems so insane yet plausible in the world that's been established. Also, what the hell happened to the Gravedigger? Let's see this guy come back in some mad way. Maybe he's the true god that controls everything. You know, or not. Who the hell knows? All of this sounds so utterly ridiculous, but then I guess it wouldn't be much of a story if it didn't. So that does it for this video, guys. It took a lot of effort to make this one. I had to read a book and learn Elder Futhark, a dead Norse language. So I hope you enjoyed it. Despite the effort, it was loads of fun to make. Let me know what you think of this theory. Do you agree with me? Did you hold on tight enough, or are your nuts plastered all over the wall? If you liked the video, leave a like. If you didn't, leave a dislike. I'll hate you forever, but I'll understand. The next video is about Marvel Spider-Man. I'm going to be recapping everything that we know after the Game Informer coverage and going a little deeper into my theory. I know that this channel might be starting to seem like it's only God of War and Spider-Man, but don't worry. After that, I've got a video about Days Gone, and then a little bit later, we have something about the Arkham franchise and why I think it's time that the Prince of Persia franchise returns. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one.